Well, good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for coming and welcome to everybody online. My name's Matt Betts. I think a lot of you know me. I'm a professor here in the College of Forestry, lead PI of the H.J. Andrews, and I have a worrying bird habit, I think many of you would acknowledge. So I'm just going to give a few opening remarks, and then we're going to go to a presentation by Norm and Jerry and Gordy. So Tom asked me to provide just a brief introduction. So I have read most of the book, and I have to say, if anything, this is an incredibly humbling read. You know, this is a book about a policy that transformed forest management in the Northwest, and I would say is one of the most ambitious forest conservation plans in the world. And so reading through it reminded me, I knew some of this historical context, but it reminded me of how small my own work is. So one of the elements, when I was 6 in 1976, a young lad named Eric Forsman completed his master's thesis on this little known owl. I love the title of the thesis was A Preliminary Investigation of Spotted Owl in Oregon. Classic Eric, with incredibly humility. It turned out to be quite an important owl. When I turned 11, Jerry was in the process of convincing the Forest Service that maybe scientists should have a look at the H.J. Andrews at old growth forest, because it might not just be decadent, and it might actually have more about it than a biological desert does. So during this time, pre and post plan development, so many critical ecological thoughts came about, and many of which I teach to my students now. So minimum viable populations, adaptive management, the importance of old growth, the role of disturbance in forests, the notion of landscape connectivity that's become so important in landscape ecology. So it's my pleasure to introduce these three guys who really don't need much introduction at all. All of them are definitely approaching the status of old growth themselves, but I can say from personal experience, they're not behaving in a decadent way in recent years, and all of them are still exerting a strong influence on forest policy across the Northwest around the world. So Norm Johnson has an undergrad in forestry from Berkeley and a PhD here at Oregon State. Norm's an emeritus professor in forest policy and has been teaching here forest policy for 30 years, and of course, an author of the Northwest Forest Plan. Gordy Reeves, also a PhD from Oregon State University in fisheries biology, and has had interests in freshwater ecology of salmon and trout and their conservation, and has been a senior research biologist with a Forest Service Pacific Northwest Research Station, and still serves and is involved with planning for the Elliott State Research Forest. And Jerry Franklin has a doctorate in botany and soils from Washington State University. We won't hold that against him because he was here for quite a while. And an author of the Northwest Forest Plan, as you all know, an emeritus professor at the University of Washington. And I describe him to my undergrads as sort of the Jagger of old growth. So with that, I'm going to leave it to Norm, who's going to come up and introduce you to the book.
Thank you. We're gonna zip through this and then have questions at the end. By the way, this picture is from Eric Forsman. This Dan Donato took this picture of his family. It's just a wonderful addition to the book. Okay, yes, sure. Did begin with Eric Forsman's interest in northern spotted owl, and his finding that there were like any species of owls that people had studied before. Huge home ranges, large amounts of old forest. That was in the 70s. And that certainly led to a battle of the future of old growth federal forests in the Northwest that convulsed the region for at least a decade. And we were in the middle of it. And as it says on the back of the book, tree sitters, logger protests, dying timber downs, an iconic species on the brink. The timber wars consumed the Pacific Northwest in the late 1980s and early 90s, and led political leaders to ask scientists for a solution, and the Northwest Forest Plan was the result. Now, first, look a little at this for a minute, and we're studying the forests, the federal forests within the range of the northern spotted owl. And actually, ancestral lands of indigenous people covered this range. Now, as we see, the federal forests are a major part of it, with the especially on the Cascades and the Coast Range, down into the Klamath Mountains, and also the BLM holdings that are mainly a checkerboard in Southwest Oregon are a part of it. Tribal nations have reservation forests, but also they, with their treaty rights, they have rights considerably beyond that. Sustained yield, the pathway to the greatest good. That was Gifford Pinchot's approach, setting policy goals in something called the Campaign to Save America, as part of Theodore Roosevelt's efforts to break monopolies and to go from this kind of vagabond industries that were sweeping across the country. And in terms of timber, where they'd create boom towns for a while and then ghost towns. And he was bound and determined to change that. And the idea was a sustained harvest of timber over time, and also to prevent timber famine. Old growth was the fuel for the sustained yield engine, where the notion was you'd meter it out, the old growth, until the plantations that came after it were able to provide a harvest. But it really was seen as a fuel for the sustained yield engine, and that national forest plans for most of the 20th century focused on that theme. In 1980 and 1990, the Forest Service in Region 6 struggled to create forest plans under new legislation, implementing the regulations under the National Forest Management Act. And they really struggled, and I was part of that struggle, to find politically acceptable plans that would meet conservation requirements, especially to provide well-distributed habitat and federal lands for viable populations of vertebrates. Remember that so much of this story surrounds that idea. And attention focused especially on conservation of the northern spotted owl. But the forest plans did not survive court tests, in part because there was a real desire to limit the impact of owl conservation on harvest, and that greatly influenced the policies that were proposed. Litigation brought about by environmental groups in the court of Judge Dwyer in Western Washington resulted in the judge enjoining timber sales of owl habitat. You've heard of Jack Ward Thomas, and we'll see him in a minute. You've heard of Jerry Franklin. Judge Dwyer was as important to all of this. He had taken some forestry and landscape classes, and he really had a deep understanding of forest ecosystems. And he greatly influenced the outcome. The litigation brought by environmental groups led him to enjoin timber sales of owl habitat, where most of the harvest was coming from. A permanent injunction until the case was resolved, and he opined that he thought the plaintiffs would prevail. The Forest Service chief at that point gave up with trying to slightly modify forest plans to develop better conservation strategies for the owl, and took an amazing step that totally changed both the way planning was done and the outcomes within the range of the northern spotted owl. He commissioned an independent group of scientists, the Interagency Scientific Committee led by Jack Ward Thomas, to develop a scientifically credible conservation plan for the northern spotted owl. And you know, that just, Fred Swanson said, boy, that was a totally different way of looking at things. He really has talked to me about that than the previous way, which is trying to minimize the impact of any efforts to achieve these viability for these species, to minimize the impact on timber harvest. The bureaucratic seas parted, literally and figuratively. And scientists marched in. And things have never been the same since in this region. There are 5 sequential science assessments that were done that progressively broadened the old forest species and ecosystems considered. But Jack Ward Thomas, he did a number of oral histories that we talk about in the book. As he said, this was not science per se. Science is a testing of a hypothesis. These efforts were assessments, management planning, development alternatives by a group of scientists. That's not science, that's scientists doing planning. And planning that put wild science, as we call it, from the 70s and 80s to work in reshaping policy. Now, come on up, guys.
This is where I got involved and where a lot of you people here at Corvallis got involved. We got involved with a different kind of science. Now, we've been studying forests for probably 100 years, certainly 50 years, seriously. But the research had all been focused really on how to produce wood in plantations. So we learned about how to grow Doug fir, how to cut it, how to regenerate it, how to thin it. But we really never looked at the Douglas fir ecosystem and how it worked. Nobody was looking at the natural forest to see what was there, what kind of activity went on there. And there wasn't any interest on the part of the Forest Service or Oregon State University School of Forestry to do anything to find out about it. But there was a sack of money. Came through the National Science Foundation called the International Biological Program. And some scientists went to Congress. Congress stuffed some money down the throat of the National Science Foundation, said, you know, fund IBP, the US IBP program in the late 60s. And the focus of that program were on studies of 6 ecosystems, one of which was the Western coniferous forest biome. And the University of Washington had the head start on that. They had the inside track, but a bunch of us from Corvallis went up to Seattle for a meeting that UW had to put on to engage broader audience. And we ultimately got into about a 6 or 8 month fist fight between Corvallis and Seattle as to who was going to get some money. And in the end, we almost lost the program, but we got a big chunk of it. So we got a sack of money to study a Douglas fir ecosystem. Then we had a bunch of fistfights here in Corvallis because a lot of the people in Corvallis said the future is plantations. That is what we should study. But some of us said, no, we need to look at an old growth Douglas fir ecosystem and see what's there and how it works. And so that's what we did ultimately. And we went to the Andrews Experimental Forest. There was a watershed there that had already been monitored, and we decided, okay, we're going to do this work. And so we had no hypotheses. Forget about hypotheses. We didn't know enough about an old growth ecosystem to have a hypothesis. So we just said, okay, what we'll do is budgets. That'll get us into this. We'll do a carbon budget, that's energy. We'll do a water budget. Of course, that was largely done already. And we'll do a nutrient budget, a materials kind of a budget. And we went to work. And of course, we began to discover really fundamentally obvious things that we found to be exciting discoveries. And I'll just say one of them. The first thing we discovered was, oh, there's a lot of dead wood out there. Snags, down logs, and other kinds of woody debris. And it's in the stream too. And you can't balance your carbon budget without taking account of this stuff. There's just too much of it. Now, you have to understand that, you know, in retrospect, that's so obvious it hurts. But it was not obvious in prospect. Only in retrospect is it obvious. And furthermore, IBP was doing a global synthesis of the carbon dynamics of forests. And there was no provision in that global synthesis for dead wood, because nobody had dead wood to the degree that we have it in our forests in the Northwest. So anyway,
Jerry, how did the managers respond to
the managers, the foresters were not happy. Because we had learned, they had taught us, dead trees have no value. They're a fire hazard, they're an impediment, they're a danger. The only value they have is to put them on a truck and haul them to the mill. And so here we begin to say, no, you know, a healthy forest has a lot of dead wood in it because it's so important for so many things, including habitat. So,
Thanks, Jerry.
and,
Marty?
and obviously, this is not the kind of science that the dean of the forestry school was interested, or the director of the experiment station was interested in. That's why we call it wild science. Science that examines the fundamental premises on which activities are based.
Well, I wasn't around then. I showed up on the scene in 1980 and was over here at the lab, and Fred Everett and Jim Siddell were there, and they were all about landslides. Prior to that, in Mapleton, there was this whole issue about landslides and the negative aspects of it. And Fred and Jim were all about going out and looking at it, actually looking at it. And then what they were seeing was that landslides maybe weren't as bad as everybody was suspecting. So the whole focus, our whole focus over there became this idea of looking at systems in a dynamic way. And that was really quite different than the way things were going, which was a much more static perspective.
And so spring of 1990, and this is the first of the 5 science assessments. And it really set the model for how you do that. New conservation strategy for the northern spotted owl by the ISC, Jack Ward Thomas and owl biologists. And basically after much review and study, they decided that they ought to have large reserves sufficient for a self-sustaining population, local population of owls, close enough together so that they can readily disperse to other reserves. They published this and it just blew the wheels off the timber wagon. It was shocking that some little creature that few had ever seen, and you generally couldn't eat, was somehow ruling the world. I was there then, and it just totally shocked us. Establish a new template for how political leaders and managers answer federal policy questions. You form a group of respected scientists, independent of management agencies and political influence. You give them questions to answer and the freedom to recommend new conservation frameworks. This means they need to step beyond what they know for sure, try to put things together and say, given what we know and what we hypothesize and what our hunches are, this is the conservation framework we would suggest. It takes a special kind of scientist. I like to call them wild scientists. My friends think it makes them look frivolous, but still, that, it takes an unusual person to want to do that. And also that the political leaders and managers will stay out of the way and rely on the power of scientific authority. Well, 1 second. Whoops, sorry. The Forest Service decided to accept this strategy, and they hoped that would solve their problems. They would adjust the forest plans that they and I had worked on for a decade and get back to business. It so happened that the Judge Dwyer rejected the proposal again on procedural grounds. He said that the ISC was the first scientifically respectable proposal he had seen, but he still rejected. And in addition, Congress was wondering, wait a minute here, we know there are a lot of creatures in the forest. Can the spotted owl ever take care of them all? So they asked 4 of us that became known as the Gang of 4. Probably that wasn't a compliment.
It wasn't intended as a compliment. That was at the time of the Chinese had the gang, remember?
And so that was Jack Ward Thomas. He's on the second from left. John Gordon's on the left, the Different Show professor, the Different Show professor of Yale and the dean, myself, and Jerry Franklin.
And this was really a lot of fun at this point in time. They called the four of us in to sort of tell them, what was the situation? What could they do to resolve the situation? And so that was the four of us, and we'd never worked together at all before that, but we went back there and we each sat, and of course, Norm was really the expert on allowable cut calculations. I was the expert on old growth forest. Gordon was just, the nearest thing we had to a senior statesman in forestry. And of course, Jack was Jack. So anyway, we did this, and then what happened after this session was there were a couple of sessions where we sat, in offices with some of the members of the House. And there was one meeting with Congressman Volkmer, who was a Southern Democrat, very powerful, chair of the Ag Committee, which also, of course, has the Forestry Subcommittee. And so we were finishing up a very modest lunch, talking with him, and I saw him writing on the back of an envelope. And I said, Congressman, what are you doing? He said, I'm writing down what we need to put in a bill to solve this. He was writing it on the back of an envelope. Well, fine. He went back to his work and he looked up at me and he said, if you could just tell us where the good old growth is, we could solve this problem. And I sat there for a minute. And then I said, well, I think that we could do that if you needed that information. And in the meantime, Jack Thomas was trying to kick me and was kicking Norm instead.
Which made Jack feel better, but did not deter Jerry.
So in any case, we ended up with this incredible assignment in a matter of 6 weeks to map the old forests within the range of the spotted owl and grade them as to their quality. I had no idea how the hell we were going to do that, but that's what we were going to do. And as we left that room that day, we were going out the door was almost shut, and Volker said, and don't forget the damn fish. We don't want some fish blowing us out of the water after we've got this all solved. And so that, of course, it had broadened from owls to old growth, and now we were dealing with the aquatic system and the salmon as well. And it was at that point that Gordy and Jim Siddell were brought into the process to help us do that. And of course, Tom Spees was very much a part of the process. Ultimately, we mapped it, we graded it, we did it by essentially bringing all of the expertise from the field into a central location. And we actually arranged tables for each of the forests or BLM districts in the same geographic arrangement in which they actually existed, so that they could talk to their neighbors. And we did map the old growth. And we went back to Congress.
Jerry, talk about the 80-year threshold that you and Spees worked up in an afternoon.
Yeah. So anyway, they said, old growth, but Tom and I thought, hey, there's some younger forests that aren't old growth yet in a traditional sense, but they're contributing to late successional habitat. And I had particularly, and I know Tom knew about this too, the Yakult burn from 1902. So we decided we'd look at all the forests back to that time. And we said, would look at all the forests that are 80 years or older. Now, that was explicitly to capture the Yakult bird. Is that right, Tom?
One of your favorite places.
So anyway, that's how the peculiar thing. It would have been easier just to make it 100 years, but
Last Friday in the Capitol Press, which is as they say, a magazine, or it's a weekly of food and fiber. They were the climate advisor for the White House was asked with the president's new executive order that you have to basically map and develop, or at least make an estimate of the inventory of mature and old, and also develop policy. They're saying, well, nobody knows what mature is. And in response, the climate advisor said, well, an 80-year-old tree can be considered mature. 30 years later, that rule that they dreamed up one afternoon is still there. It's kind of amazing. Okay, and so as Jerry said, that and they call the forest, they will map late successional old growth to get the younger forest in there. And Jerry, you want to talk about?
on the left is a mature forest. Happens to be on the Andrews, and then the old growth forest is on the right. That happens to be at Mount Rainier, that particular picture. But we've really learned a lot, even since we did the Gang of Four, about the mature forest and the important processes that are going on in the mature forest. And these forests are probably the only complete forest ecosystems that we have in the Douglas fir region. Everything else has been modified. These are complete in terms of the parts, the organisms, the processes.
So, there is a map of highly significant LSOG areas in Oregon. And it was developed in 6 days. And it was first a map that had been produced. But we didn't have any fish people in the Gang of Four. And so when Volkmer said, don't forget the damn fish, we had to find some. And in a hurry. And some congressional aide had suggested Gordy Reeves, who I didn't know. But he said he was really sort of duking it out with the Forest Service on the Elk River, and in fact, logging. And frankly, when you're doing these kind of studies, you need reasonable people, but you need people that are willing to engage in a fight, if need be. So I called Gordy one day, one evening, I had never met, to come up and help us for a few days. And then we think Thomas asked Jim Siddell. So go ahead, Gordy.
It's 4:30, so we need to move.
Yep, okay. Well, real quickly, Norm called 9 o'clock on a Monday night, introduces himself, says, can you come and help me? I have to remember, I have no idea who Norm Johnson is, what he did, whatever he was. Oh, sure, we can do that. A couple minutes later, Jim Siddell calls me up and he is like bouncing. I can just imagine he's bouncing around the room. We got to get to Portland tomorrow. And these are the big kahunas. We got an audience with them. We got to make a good first impression. He said, meet me at 5:30 in the parking lot back here, and we'll do something on the way up. Well, at just about this time, there was a paper that had come out called Salmon at the Crossroads, which was the first real. It's hard to imagine now that there were no listed fish populations in Oregon and Washington at the time. This paper identified the populations were in trouble. So Jim used it. We used this as our sort of calling card to meet with the Gang of Four, and we had to actually make a case why fish had to be included. And about partway through that, John Gordon goes, "Wait," and he had this really deep voice. He said, "You guys just changed the game." He said, "Fish are going to change the whole nature of this debate." He said, people don't really care about the spotted owl. They can't eat it. They can't do anything with it. But you tell them that their salmon and their streams are in trouble, and we're gonna get a whole bunch of different types of attention in this whole thing. So we were in, and so we put together these components that dealing with key watershed, how to riparian management and so on. And we did this and made our way to Congress with these guys.
And actually, they developed this conservation framework driving up there that morning to meet us. Now, okay, so we're doing this analysis, and their proposal had one really key component. It was to put substantial buffers on non-fish streams, which was a major change. And now this I am going to cover real briefly. And by the way, what we're going through here is the book. Okay, as best we can. And there's a lot of detail, of course, in it, but we didn't develop a choice. We didn't develop a proposal like the Thomas Committee. Do this and it'll save the. We developed a set of choices, more than this actually, but here's some here's the highlights. And in those choices, we evaluated them from an ecological standpoint and an economic standpoint, with economics being the timber harvest level. And we have 5 criteria. Probability of retention of habitat sufficient to meet the requirements in the National Forest Management Act. We had 5 evaluation criteria, and we evaluated this probability of retention from very low to very high. And we first did the forest plans. And I was stunned. I thought, oh, damn, there goes all that work. Look at that. This, by the way, this evaluation was done at the OSU Center and was done in 3 or 4 days. And more studies after it did not reach different conclusions. It was really kind of amazing. But oh my gosh, look at the forest plans.
And this was the summary chart when we reported back to the congressional committees. This was the only visual aid we used. That chart, just about that size.
Yeah,
in the room.
it's a poster board.
And it was stunning. Those politicians could understand very clearly that there was no free lunch. There's no way out of this in which you're going to be able to have owls and old growth and fish without having a tremendous impact on timber harvest. In fact, they knew exactly where their decision space was. And it was on the right 3 columns.
And just before we get there, just this then, but with the forest plans plus the Thomas report, would that fix things? And that some people had real hope for it. And no, it still is. There's all the low and moderately low. And the congressman from Eastern Oregon, Bob Smith, very conservative at the time, he said to me, Norm, you could have written a shorter report. He said, because of all these choices, Congress isn't going to legislate anything with an L in it. And he actually defined the threshold. But they did it, not us. To get over here to where you had at least high on everything, at least medium high on everything, it's a harvest level just 25% of the past decade. And
They understood it.
they
But
certainly
it was
did.
tremendous sticker shock. And this was where they faced the reality that in fact, they could not achieve goals without big impacts on timber harvest. And they accepted the reality of that.
Yeah, but interestingly, no one in Congress said anything critical about this report. A different age, right? No one did. This was not a partisan issue in those days. It was a sectional issue, not a partisan. No, they didn't. No. Of course, how could these guys in 6 weeks do this? I mean, you know, but they had hired us. We were their people. We had reported. We didn't tell them what to do. We just said, this is what we know. And Forest Service chiefs and the regional forest are outraged at the conclusion that the new forest plans would not protect fish. They really got upset with Jim and Gordy, really got upset. They brought in these.
Well, this was probably the easiest conclusion I've ever reached in my career. I read the forest plan. The forest plan simply said, except for maybe one, that fish habitat was going to decline. It was right there in black and white. There was nothing more you could conclude from this. We didn't have to do any analysis or anything else. I simply read the forest plan, Xeroxed the pages. Forest fish habitat is going to decline. We got sort of ambushed by the higher ups in the Forest Service and berated for being bad employees, and I just handed them the file, a file with all the forest plan highlighted. They couldn't.
Obviously, the chief had not read this forest.
I don't think anybody in the Washington office had read the forest plan. They were just shocked.
They had two task forces. They set up to try to refute their findings, unsuccessful. 2 or 3 months later, they put Siddell and Reeves in charge of the fish strategy. Amazing times.
Paid to hustle, Norm.
Spring of 92, the Forest Service again proposes an elk conservation strategy. Dwyer, though, doesn't accept it because he said this other report just came out that says other ogo species will be in trouble. The Forest Service commissions yet another science assessment. Jack Ward Thomas is leading it. It's a SAT report to provide habitat conditions on federal land conducive to high viability for all species, vertebrates and non-vertebrate, even though the regulation just called for vertebrate. You know how many non-vertebrates there are in an old-growth forest? Eventually 1,000 were considered. So this really changed things. And they did it a high likelihood. They recommended a number of additional protections, including surveys for those species we didn't know much about. Oh, wait a minute here. But that now the SAT report came out just as the Clinton administration was coming into office. And when candidate Clinton, when he was up in Seattle, he was talking to friendly during the campaign about September of 92. He said to these folks, Seattle labor and business, they're very friendly. They talked about urban issues. He had an assistant with him, Katie McGinty, who had been Gore's advisor when he's in the Senate. And she said, don't get into the Isle timber issue. It's intractable. And they didn't come up. He's leaving the room. We interviewed Katie and many White House people for this. And he just turned and said to him, and in addition, if you elect us, we will solve this issue, the Isle timber issue, in the first few months of our presidency. She was devastated because she knew she didn't. At any rate, that really happened. That's how they got into it. They held a forest conference where a lot of people got. How many people remember the forest conference? Well, you're pretty young, some of you, but at any rate, it did happen in 93. Okay, and so he calls for another science assessment, but this time the goal is to maintain the highest service level possible, meeting legal requirements for all growth species and ecosystems. But the plan must be scientifically sound, ecologically credible, and legally responsible. Whoa, I still can't find it. What a great set of guiding principles, you know? Key question, how much LSOG forest will be needed? Lake succession long growth. Scientists sequestered on the 14th floor of the US Bank building for months. Scores of scientists. There was a guard at the door. Nobody could get in and barely could we get out. And Katie McGinty was the link with the scientists and the president. And the president was directly involved in this and did make the decisions. We developed options that divided the federal forest and lake successional reserves, riparian reserves, and matrix. We met with the Clinton administration in Washington, and they were deeply disappointed over the projected harvest levels. Deeply disappointed. The scientists that were at the meeting, and he was, and I was, and Thomas, we volunteered to go back and try again. They had stayed out of this. They weren't trying to get us to bend the science. They just were so disappointed at the harvest levels. To develop a more integrated or efficient option that became known as option 9. And in the book, Jack Ward Thomas, in our book, I quoted Jack Ward Thomas that says, Jerry Franklin was the father of option 9. 2 minutes, Jerry.
Well, I won't take 2 minutes for it. It was very simple. When we were in the Pink Tower, the aquatically oriented people were doing their thing. The terrestrial people were doing their thing. There wasn't a lot of interchange going on. And we saw the possibility of bringing up additional land for timber harvest by in fact integrating the goals of the aquatic and terrestrial people. We could do a more efficient job of preservation with it. And so that's what option 9 was. It was simply an effort to bring more of the aquatic and the terrestrial together. There was no time for that as a part of the regular process.
So that did enable the harvest level to increase with about the same, slightly, with about the same protection for other resources. Okay, released, the option 9 is the president's plan, released on July 1st after a furious debate within the White House. And we managed to get go to Little Rock. We worked deep into the presidential library there and got out the memos and various statements that were made back and forth within the administration. Ron Emanuel, who was the president's political advisor, the chief of staff for President Obama, then mayor of Chicago, and on, he said about this, we need to address the gap between the political reality and the scientific reality of this issue. The foundation for decision-making on the timber issue has been placed in the scientific community. However, scientific analysis says we must reduce cutting by 70%. Clearly, this would be economically destructive, not to mention the fact it'd be hard to sell politically. We are therefore in a difficult and potentially perilous position. And he urged the president not to move forward. And all the way up to the trying to get into the middle of the meetings on the decision. At any rate, the president went on. Called for a 75% decrease in the allowable cut. Landscape plan constructed on the viability of 3 species, hundreds of other species, those pesky non-vertebrates got low viability ratings because little was known about their habitat needs. As we talk about in the book, boy, was there a stormy reception. President Clinton announced it in a live announcement. Public criticism centered on a massive drop in the allowable cut and the hundreds of species doomed to extinction due to low viability ratings. Tribal nations were dismayed that they had not been involved in preparing the plan. But government lawyers looked at those viability ratings and says, we got to do something about that. And they, one more science assessment, the last one, with instruction to raise the viability ratings of both vertebrates and non-vertebrates. And some of the added protections would have to be done through surveys and on-the-ground adjustment to protect species when found, which became known as survey and managed. Birth of the forest plan in late '94. And approximately 80% of the LSOG forest was reserved. The rest of it, though, was in the matrix, and it potentially could be harvested. Judge Breyer admired the plan and approved it. And here, what you ought to really focus on, the green is wilderness and related reserves. The blue are the late successional reserves. And that's what Franklin and Spies and others drew. Okay, and the gold, different shades of gold are matrix. But in addition, within the matrix, there's a greatly expanded riparian reserves from the past, greatly expanded. You want to see?
Yeah, this was probably one of the more controversial parts of what we proposed. Partly dealing with the size of the riparian areas and the expansion into the non-fish bearing streams. Fred And Kelly Burnett did some real seminal work in terms of just laying out the justification for these areas. And I hadn't even thought about it until we gave a seminar a few weeks ago over at Stream Team, and Stan Gregory said this was a seminal moment in terms of forest management, because all of a sudden we moved away from looking at aquatic ecosystems as a set distance from the stream to looking at them in an sort of from ecological process, ecological context. And there was a lot of challenge. The curves that went into this and this whole idea were really challenged quite extensively, particularly by the industry when they came out, but we survived it. The evidence is only, accumulated to suggest that this approach has been a solid one.
And also, standards of the North Forest Plan recognize moist and dry forests, moist being the blue and green, and dry being the red, orange, and yellow, and with somewhat different standards for them, especially in terms of fuel treatments in the dry forest. But that's still the plan was mostly a moist forest plan and just slightly adjusted for the dry forest. Now in this, even though when it came out, it was 1.1 billion was the harvest, a 75 to 80% drop. Then after some adjustment, some accounting, some real, it ended up at 850 and then dropped to 800. That's called the probable sale quantity, the projected level of timber sales. But what happened was this logging in this period from 1995 to 2012 was supposed to be based on late successional forests. And after some initial harvest of them, partly because Congress through writers set aside the Northwest Forest Plan for a little bit, the harvest level collapsed. And what happened is that you see this, and for a variety of reasons, survey and manage did, because of the need to leave buffers around species like the retrievals, did make harvest difficult in some LSOG stands. There were a new set of managers. The Clinton administration brought in many wildlife and fish people. They just weren't too enthused about that. The scientists, me and Franklin, said, man, this isn't working. And so did Thomas. The public quite rapidly turned against it through the surveys. And there were protests and litigation, and that it collapsed. The harvest collapsed, and the Forest Service timber program had a near-death experience.
450.
And moist forest plantation thinning saved the federal timber program. Went to thinning the moist forests and trying to create more structurally and compositionally diverse forests, and it really saved them. Scorecard for the Northwest Forest Plan after 30 years. And by the way, this last section includes vignettes from managers as they try to implement it, and much more depth than we're giving here on what happened. But still, there's a scorecard. Okay, Franklin, you want to?
Sure. I like to say that, the plan changed everything and resolved very little. And the next slide and this one really talk to that. First of all, it really did stop the logging of the older forest. It wasn't the plan that stopped it all, but the combination of the plan and social unrest with regards to attempting to do any more logging in the older forest essentially has stopped it. Significant harvesting. It did stabilize the habitat for the owl, but it did not solve the problem of the owl because of the barred owl. And in fact, the barred owl will make the spotted owl go extinct if we do not have a program to reduce barred owl and at least a part of the spotted owl habitat. It improved the aquatic habitat very definitely on federal land, but as Gordy could tell you, you can't solve the problem with regards to the fish just on the federal land. You have to get into the lower elevation lands, the managed forests, privately owned, and the agricultural lands. And it proved difficult to do the economic assistance.
Okay, that in fact, Some communities didn't suffer too badly, those near I-5, but the small isolated communities that in FEMA and in the Clinton administration that knew we're going to have struggle, the economic assistance generally didn't get to them in their time. And they really bore the cost of this. And they still do, of the big change. Next, why it matters. It's lasted 30 years. It's lasted 30 years. Established a scientifically sound, ecologically credible, and legally responsible. And it implemented ecosystem planning, considered old growth aquatic ecosystems, presented on alternative tree farms, and made planning more than an art of the deal. That there are some environmental standards you have to meet. Recommendations for the future. The first one is to greatly increase recognition of the rights and goals of tribal nations. They were largely left out of the Northwest Forest Plan. Some of what was done does benefit them, like the aquatic strategy, but still they were largely left out, and that of course needs to change. Then Franklin.
Two things on the next step. One of them is we really believe that the remaining mature and old moist forests need to be reserved in any kind of revision of the Northwest Forest Plan. The other thing that needs to happen is in the dry forest, the frequent fire forest landscapes, we need to have a really aggressive program of restoring a structure which is resistant and resilient to fire. And the focus there is not on reserves of forest, but on retention and protection of the old trees that are a part of that landscape.
And then the barred owls.
The third thing there is the barred owls, and I already alluded to that. The only hope for the spotted owl is some kind of program to reduce the frequency with which they encounter barred owls. And the Fish and Wildlife Service will probably, before the end of this year, be proposing some kind of program. We have no idea exactly what it's going to be.
But Jerry, also, the barred owl's impact on all the other species of the.
Well, oh, yeah. The big deal about the barred owl is it is a new top predator that is impacting organisms that have never had such a voracious and abundant predator. And so that's really the more serious problem than simply the impacts on the northern spotted owl. This is a new top predator that is preying very aggressively, and it's very fecund, has very small territories, and eats everything that it can possibly get its beak around.
Gordy.
Yeah, one thing, when we started these efforts, there was one population of salmon listed in the region of northern spotted owl. There's now over 30. And we were anticipating that, but we were also under the direction to put as much responsibility for recovery of listed and potentially listed fish onto the federal land. What we've learned since, as Norm said earlier, the federal land cannot make a major contribution to the recovery of the listed fish. They simply don't have the productive capacity to do it. They're not in the portions of the network that historically produce fish. And so what we've got to do is it's got to be a much more encompassing program for recovery that includes non-Forest Service areas and non-BLM areas, non-federal areas actually. And that's going to be the key to recovery of the fish. It's not going to be the Northwest Forest Plan.
And Jerry gets the last word.
The final item is that we feel we have a real challenge on the federal lands on the west side, the moist forest, in terms of replacing the plantations we've created with forests, managed forests that are structurally complex and biologically rich. The plantations were never intended to do anything other than be very efficient in producing wood. And not surprisingly, they don't do well at providing a lot of other ecological work, functions, values that we want. And so we don't want to replace the current plantations with just another round of even age monoculture Douglas fir. We want instead to transition to manage forest landscapes that have forests that are structurally complex, not single species, single even age, and are biologically diverse. And that's really going to require very active kinds of management, not just thinning, but in fact, some significant creation of openings and starting some forests from scratch that have that kind of diversity, including, hopefully, some hardwoods as a very significant component of those systems. So,
And that, my friends, is a capsule summary of our book.
We have about 5 minutes for questions before we get kicked out. And then there's a reception outside in theory with some food and drink, and you can ask these guys more questions while we're there. So we have a couple questions on Zoom, but we'll prioritize people in the room here.
The question about survey and manage. So a couple of years ago, the BLM basically got rid of survey and manage when they revised their forest plan.
Yes.
And I wonder what three of your thoughts are on that, and whether you think that the Forest Service is likely to do a similar thing. And I'm particularly wondering about it because I feel like that's kind of going to be a barrier to doing more variable retention harvest in the plantations.
The survey and manage doesn't apply to the plantations.
But
It applies to the older forest.
My understanding is that it applies for thinning under 80, but if we do regeneration under 80, it does still apply?
You've raised a good question, and that hasn't been court tested, okay? It hasn't been court tested. The Forest Service now is trying to put together a group to advise them. Franklin will probably be on it. And that's certainly an issue they're gonna need to tackle. Yeah. I think it'd be harder for the Forest Service to walk away from that unless they do the purpose of survey and manage was to do with old growth species. If they reserve moist forest old growth, then you don't need it anymore. Okay, so the logic suggests you can get up from it. But with all things to do with the Forest Service, it's always sticky.
Thank you.
What do you guys think of the proposed BLM guidelines that include conservation as a potentially use?
as a what?
The BLM's proposed guidelines that are in review now that include conservation as one of the multiple uses for federal land.
Norm? You're better to do that than I.
He always gives me the easy questions. I think that it's kind of fun, hard for me to get my mind around, but I think they're trying to recognize other values, and I think that's great. Okay, I think it's great to move in that direction. I don't really know what it means yet, but I think that's good. Yeah, they've always, they used to be known as the Bureau of BLM, the Bureau of Logging, Grazing, and Mining, and so that's good.
And I'd add to that, we're feel very positive about many aspects of the BLM's plan that they've created to replace their participation in the Northwest Forest Plan. I think I'll speak for myself and simply say it's fascinating that probably the most timber-oriented public agency I've ever seen was the BLM. And they are now the most innovative management organization in the state of Oregon. So, it's not to say they're perfect, but they have moved dramatically towards adopting ecological forest management.
Yeah, and in our book, we are complementary toward their moist forest strategy. We absolutely are. And yeah,
One more question, I think we need to go, just so you know, we do have 65 people online and the questions are sort of flooding in. But I think we can save them and we'll send them to you later for your answering pleasure. But when you want to.
Wildfire and climate change, drought especially. I mean, doesn't that change everything?
Well, obviously, the plantations are the most vulnerable to all the aspects of climate change, including the increase in disturbance regimes. And so moving towards more ecologically whole, more complete, multi-age, species diverse systems not only helps us to have more functional federal forests, but also those are going to be more resistant to disturbances. They're going to be more resilient following disturbances, and they're going to generally be more adaptive to the changes that occur. And one of the reasons we want the mature and old that exist to be left alone is because there's nothing we can do to improve their ability to adapt under climate change. So
On the east side of the coast range,
I'm talking about the Douglas fir.
I've got lots of Douglas fir, and it's this big around. And it's nothing but a fuel ladder from the ground up to the top. And I don't agree. I think we can improve that.
Well, we can have a debate about this.
Okay.
just one last thing. We, because of what you raised on the dry forests especially, yeah, we think they're really in peril, in tremendous peril.
This is not dry.
Yeah, I
I
understand.
don't know what you mean by dry forest, but it's what I usually hear. The east side of the coast range is not dry, what you're thinking about.
Some of it is, as a matter of fact.
South. The south.
Yeah.
I just want to kind of add to what Phil was saying, that I agree with him. And what's interesting is that when you guys started all of this, you had certain principles you wanted to adhere to, and you had goals. And one of the newer goals that wasn't thought of them is that how can we manage natural ecosystems to maximize carbon sequestration? Natural climate solution is all the rage. And of course, that's all about fire and fire regime. And I actually think sort of if carbon sequestration, particularly in soil, which of course is where all the carbon is, I would tend to agree with Bill that there needs to be this movement towards understanding what makes wildfire and what doesn't. And that wasn't in the original, which is sort of exciting. It means that there's a new direction, and the Northwest Forest Plan isn't, it's not over. But I think that needs to be considered. And if you guys do anything, it's to encourage them to not stop now, but keep having new voices, new concerns, new ideas going forward with the Northwest Forest Plan. And even if Phil is old, you can put him on it to cause trouble.
I think that's an excellent place to start and fodder for conversation over small treats and drinks out in the hallway. So thank you very much.
Carrie, without, right?